Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and as I'm writing this on July 15th, 2023, we just passed 10,000 downloads of the podcast in 7 months. I am so pleased. I thought there would be like 12 listeners plus my mom, so I'm really happy to see that there are far more listeners than I had expected, plus my mom. So please feel free to share the show with anyone who you think may be interested. And thank you so much for listening. It really means a lot to me. All right. We left off last week with the story of Lawrence Marek, an immigrant from modern-day Poland, and the 50 years he spent at Willard. Lawrence's story is tragic, but unfortunately not too uncommon, as we'll continue to see. As of the last episode, much of the information I'll use today will be from the book The Lives They Left Behind by Darby Penny and Peter Stastny. All other sources will be listed in the episode transcript. For now, come on in and get comfortable as we go behind the walls of Willard State Hospital. The story of Margaret Dunleavy begins in Edinburgh, Scotland in 1892, the year Margaret was born. Margaret's early life was filled with loss and sadness. She was her parents' eldest daughter. Her father was a merchant seaman who was struck in the chest by a steel cable while on a ship traveling the U.S. Great Lakes. This injury caused severe bleeding in his lungs, so when he contracted tuberculosis not long afterward, he blamed his illness on the injury and being in a damp climate. He died from TB when Margaret was only 7 years old. Following the death of her father, Margaret's mother was a 25-year-old widow with 2 children at home to provide for. She remarried soon afterward. Margaret's paternal grandmother, however, was concerned that Margaret and her sister were not being properly taken care of, although no reason was discovered for this. Nonetheless, the grandmother reported Margaret's mother to the Scottish National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. It was determined that Margaret's mother had been neglectful, and she and her sister were removed from their mother's care and placed in an orphanage. Not long after they were removed from the home, Margaret's mother died, the cause of death unknown. Of course, there's no way to know how Margaret's mother died. Even her own family said they couldn't remember. Diseases, of course, were rampant and took people's lives at a young age, but I can't help but wonder about the correlation between the loss of her husband and her children being taken away due to alleged abuse. Those would be difficult stressors for anyone in her situation. So I wonder what her mental state was like at the time. As for Margaret and her younger sister Marie, they were taken to an Edinburgh orphanage, but not much is known about their time there because the records, if there were any, are long gone. Certainly, we could make assumptions based on other orphanages at the time, which is exactly what Darby Penny and Peter Stastny did. They looked at another record by Lynn Abrams called The Orphan County, which recalled this, quote, "The orphanage routine was designed to prepare children for life after care, which was assumed to be domestic service for girls and farm service or manual labor for boys. The regimentation, household chores, and the routine of residential life all combined to create a disciplinary environment for children who had committed no crime. What would today be regarded as random and unnecessary violence, usually strokes from the strap or the cane, were regularly inflicted for a wide variety of petty misdemeanors, from failing to learn a psalm by heart to behaviors that would have been dealt with sympathetically, or that should have been dealt with sympathetically, such as bedwetting and running away," end quote. I don't want to get too sidetracked by this last part, but anytime I hear about children being punished for not learning, quote, correctly, whether it's here in this orphanage or even at modern schools, I get upset because all children learn differently. This shouldn't be a controversial point. Some children are able to easily memorize a passage from a text. Others may have undiagnosed learning disorders that impair their ability to memorize or retain information. Still, others may have a chaotic or dangerous home that they go home to, so studying really isn't a priority. Not being able to memorize a passage is generally not a behavioral issue. So when a student is disciplined as if it were something they were doing intentionally, it can be really confusing to them. Sometimes it takes a little creativity or, let's be real, trial and error on the part of the parent or teacher to figure out how a student can learn best. Obviously, in an early 20th century orphanage, they're not going to devote that much time or empathy, so harsh discipline was the route they took. I also firmly believe that physical discipline should never, ever be used in regard to bedwetting or running away. Now, granted, I am not a parent, and I can only imagine how stressful parenting can be, but bedwetting is often an involuntary sign of insecurity or trauma. Getting punished for this will only exacerbate the issue. And similarly, most young people who run away do so because something likely feels unsafe at home. There could be other issues at play as well, but again, physical discipline is not going to help that young person feel like they are loved and wanted at home. It's going to push them farther away. I could go on about this, but let's get back to Margaret. Suffice it to say that Margaret and her sister Marie probably didn't grow up in a nurturing environment. And yet, when Margaret chose to leave the orphanage at age 16, she was described as an exceptionally bright and happy girl. Her aunt, Edith Dunleavy, said that Margaret was a frequent visitor to her home in those early years. Now, oddly, Margaret would later conceal the fact that she was raised in an orphanage, telling people later that her Aunt Edith had raised her and her sister. And so that makes me wonder if she had some shame around her upbringing. After she left the orphanage, Margaret went to work as a nanny for a family in Edinburgh. By all accounts, her personality seemed well suited for caregiving roles. 4 years later, when the family she nannied for moved to London, she went with them. Margaret was 20 years old at the time. Her Aunt Edith suggested that she look into nursing. Aunt Edith later said, quote, "I thought she was adapted to it, being of a bright, kindly disposition, very practical, and possessing a sound common sense," end quote. And so that's what she did. In August 1916, 24-year-old Margaret enrolled in a nursing program at London's Northeast Metropolitan Hospital. There she met a fellow student named Florence Smith, who would remain a lifelong friend. She also met a man whose name we don't know, but we do know that they got engaged. Of course, all of this is happening in the context of World War I. Margaret's fiancé was sent to France to fight, and he was killed within a few weeks of his deployment. It was one more loss in a string of devastating losses. Adding to her seemingly unending trauma, the hospital suffered air raids. All of these events would affect the strongest, most resilient people, so there's no doubt that Margaret may have had lingering anxiety or trauma. After she completed her training in July 1918, Margaret was hired on as a probationary nurse. Her work was considered very satisfactory, and she was promoted to staff nurse in February 1919, where she remained until 1921. At that time, Margaret decided to immigrate to the United States. The reason for her move is largely unknown, but we could speculate on a few reasons. It could have been because the war was finally over and she wanted to leave behind all those losses and tragedies she'd experienced in her almost 30 years of life. She may have wanted to see what work opportunities were available to her in the US. Or, and this is the theory I give the most credence to, it could be because her good friend Florence Smith had immigrated to the US years before. It's entirely possible that she had encouraged Margaret to join her. Or maybe it was a little bit of all three. Whatever the reason, Margaret embarked on the SS Caronia and traveled from Liverpool to New York City in 1921. She found work quickly as a private duty nurse in New York City. She continued this work for about 2 years until she decided that she wanted a little bit more nursing training. So she enrolled in a graduate course in obstetrics at Women's Hospital of New York State. She was praised for her character and good work, and later she was hired by the hospital as a general duty nurse. Her work evaluation stated that she was, quote, very nervous and self-conscious and conscientious, but extremely reticent, end quote. I kind of wonder about these comments as they're more about her character rather than her work. The evaluations we have about her work appear to be good. She was a hard worker with lots of tact, very professional and dignified in her appearance. So, unless these characteristics they focused on impeded her work in any way, I wonder why they were even included. Sometimes more reserved folks make the best nurses because patients see them as more gentle and willing to listen. Early on in her training at Women's Hospital, Margaret slipped and fell on wet concrete and hit her head. It took her weeks to recover from the injury. A doctor who later worked with her said that Margaret experienced, quote, traumatic nervousness for about 9 months after the injury and frequent severe headaches, end quote. As I mentioned in the last episode, today we take these types of head injuries very seriously. Now, bear with me as I do some clinical speculating. I'm making the assumption that when Margaret slipped on the wet floor, she fell backward and hit the back of her head on the floor. If that's true, then she may have damaged her occipital lobe, which is the lobe that sort of wraps around the back of your head. The occipital lobe is responsible primarily for vision, but in addition to other functions. So it's possible that Margaret may have experienced blurry vision, which could have contributed to her severe headaches. Damage to the occipital lobe can sometimes cause visual hallucinations. People start seeing things that aren't actually there. Or they may have difficulties recognizing words or images that they would have known before. Severe damage to the occipital lobe can cause partial or complete blindness. Now, we know Margaret doesn't lose her vision, but if it is true that she hit the back of her head and damaged this part of her brain, we do see some potential evidence of lingering consequences later on. After about a year of working at Women's Hospital in 1925, Margaret had severe bleeding of the lungs and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And this must have been very frightening for her. Remember that her father had contracted and later died from TB. She was sent to the Loomis Sanatorium in the Catskills Mountains and diagnosed with, quote, moderately advanced pulmonary tuberculosis and had symptoms strongly suggestive of enteric or gastrointestinal tuberculosis, end quote. This diagnosis means that Margaret was likely in severe pain. Not only would she have the usual TB symptoms, chest pain, cough, fever, but she would also have lower abdominal pain and potential bowel obstruction. She was tough and fought it, but she would go on to have gastrointestinal problems for the rest of her life. Margaret remained at the sanatorium for 18 months until she was discharged in January 1926. She was transferred to New York City to see a specialist for her GI condition, but she didn't go, probably because she had nowhere to stay. When she had been employed in New York City before, she had lived in nurses' residences. Instead, this time she went to Buffalo to live with her friend Jessie Cole. Unfortunately, a month later, she was admitted to another TB hospital with active pulmonary tuberculosis. She would stay at the TB hospital in Perrysburg, New York for 3.5 years. Fortunately, Margaret was able to stay in touch with some friends, like Jessie Cole and Florence Smith, as well as family back in Scotland, like her Aunt Edith and Sister Marie, but she still felt very alone. While she was at Perrysburg, Margaret met another patient and fellow Scotsman named Arthur Dargaville. The two became incredibly close, although they and some of his family members insisted they were not romantically involved. Whatever the case, they seemed to have found a close friend in one another. Margaret visited Arthur's family regularly, and for 16 years, they spent quite a bit of time together. Margaret even left Arthur her money and car in a will she wrote in 1935. After Margaret was discharged from the Perrysburg Hospital in 1929, she stayed for a while with friends in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. She seemed to love this area as she collected photographs and postcards from the area. She would later look back on this place fondly as home. She returned again to Buffalo and lived with her friend Jessie Cole while doing some private duty nursing. In October 1930, 9 years after arriving in the U.S., Margaret became a naturalized U.S. citizen. The following year, she took a nursing job at Newton Memorial Hospital, a TB hospital in Cassadaga, New York. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had spent 5 years sick in a TB hospital, I probably wouldn't be too keen on getting a job at one. But Margaret did. And by all appearances, she seemed to be very happy. She was able to spend lots of time sewing her own clothes and engaging in embroidery, knitting, and crochet. She was also able to buy a used car, a 1929 Ford, and she traveled all over to visit her friends. She drove to see Arthur and his daughter. She traveled to see her friend Florence Smith and her friend Jessie Cole. And it wasn't very common for women to travel alone by car at that time, but Margaret seemed to enjoy it. In August 1936, Margaret, Florence, and Jessie took a long girls' road trip through the Adirondacks, the Green Mountains of Vermont, the White Mountains of New Hampshire, up the coast of Maine, and finally to Chester, Nova Scotia, where Margaret reunited with her sister Marie. That had to be a fun trip with good friends. In 1937, Margaret began working as a staff nurse at Herman Biggs Memorial Hospital in Ithaca, New York, which was another well-known TB facility. Here she was closer to her friend Arthur Dargaville, which was an added bonus. And Margaret seemed to do well at this hospital. There are photographs in Penny and Stastny's book of Margaret with some of her patients, which I'll include on the Facebook page and on Instagram. It was around this time that Margaret decided to pursue state licensure as a nurse. She bought exam prep books in different specialties and began studying, but the process kept taking longer and longer than she had expected. World War II had started by this time, and she worried about her family in Scotland, who were close to some of the air attacks. It must have been an incredible stressor for her. For years around this time, Margaret had been traveling about 150 miles to see a doctor in Buffalo. She clearly trusted this doctor since she was willing to drive that distance to see him. Or perhaps it was the type of medications he gave her: belladonna, codeine, and endocrine products, all of which have the potential for abuse. Administration at Biggs Hospital decided, essentially on her behalf, that Buffalo was too far to go to see a doctor. The superintendent at Biggs wrote, quote, "In January 1941, the entire situation was gone over with Miss D, and it was decided that a local physician might give her more relief than a physician as far away as Buffalo. Miss D was given the choice between a hospital attending doctor or a local private practitioner. At her request, she was transferred to Dr. Wallace, who took over her care." End quote. The sudden loss of her trusted physician clearly impacted Margaret. What should have been a change that would have been more convenient actually ended up adding more stress to her. And Margaret remained in severe physical pain and no doubt was resentful toward the superintendent that had disconnected her from her primary doctor. She began having additional problems with people at work. Penny and Stastny note, quote, "She felt the dietitians were resentful of having to prepare the special meals that had been ordered for her. There was gossip about Margaret's relationship with Arthur Dargaville. The hospital had no private telephone booths, and staff could easily eavesdrop on one another's personal calls. Margaret's overheard conversations with Arthur became the grist for the rumor mill. She continued to worry about her family in Scotland, and especially her nephew Richard, serving in the Royal Air Force in South Africa." End quote. At this time, it had been 4 years since Margaret had started trying for her nursing license. She was waiting on paperwork from London that never seemed to arrive, and she became convinced staff were hiding it from her. To make matters worse, Arthur Dargaville had a heart attack. Although he survived, Margaret blamed herself for causing additional stress in his life. Now, I can see all of this ramping up for her. The chronic physical pain she was living with, the stress of wartime and worrying about the safety of her family, feeling responsible for her friend's heart attack, and believing that people at work were against her. It all had to be overwhelming. And so when Margaret went to see her new physician, Dr. Wallace, he noticed her state of anxiety and wrote in her chart, quote, "Miss D had increasing feelings of persecution. These finally became so severe that it was felt no longer safe for her to work at the hospital," end quote. Once again, Margaret had lost her job and lost a place to live. Instead of offering her treatment recommendations in the community, Dr. Wallace recommended that Margaret be sent to Willard State Hospital, even though she had no prior psychiatric history. Margaret, now 48 years old, packed all of her belongings into 18 different trunks, suitcases, boxes, and bundles, and it was driven 40 miles from her job at Biggs Memorial Hospital in Ithaca, New York, to Willard State Hospital. She was guarded by a transfer agent and an attendant. Her admission paperwork listed her primary need for involuntary hospitalization as, quote, "Annoys people, accuses people of persecuting her and talking about her, says that she has heard one of the doctors discussing her case, says switchboard operator listens in on our conversations, and that people on other floors can be heard talking about her," end quote. This supposed paranoid ideation doesn't seem too far-fetched. I annoy people daily. I annoy my pets. Is it possible that she overheard a doctor discussing her case? Yes, entirely. She was a nurse. She knows how doctors discuss their patients' cases. Did switchboard operators listen in on calls in the 1940s? Yeah, they sure did. Even if they didn't, the clicks and sounds in the background of the phone call could probably make someone believe otherwise. And the part about hearing people on other floors discuss her case is probably the most far-fetched, but certainly not impossible. I mean, she worked there. It's entirely possible that someone could have been talking behind her back. Margaret arrived at Willard State Hospital at the end of June 1941. In her psychiatric admission assessment, the doctor who interviewed her described her as, quote, "pleasant, agreeable, and correctly oriented," and that she almost completely denied the statements made about her in the health officer's certificate. She further denies auditory and visual hallucinations. The reason for her hospitalization was explained to her, end quote. And the doctor ended up diagnosing her with dementia praecox paranoid. If you think back to episode 24, which was the first in a series about Willard State Hospital, you may remember that Willard was created with the idea that it would be the last stop for the mentally ill people who had no hope of recovery. This was not Margaret Dunleavy. Margaret was struggling with chronic pain, anxiety, probably PTSD. None of these diagnoses meant that she needed to be institutionalized, yet there she was. And when the doors closed behind her, she must have sensed a sort of finality. A week after she was admitted to Willard, Margaret's well-being seemed to decrease. Her medical record reads, quote, "She admits being hallucinated and states she hears various people but is unable to distinguish their voices," end quote. Remember that one of the possible consequences of a brain injury to the back of the head is visual hallucinations. Again, we don't know if she hit the back of her head when she slipped and fell, but it's possible. Penny and Stastny add this, quote, "Not infrequently, someone who is in crisis but has never been hospitalized before starts experiencing more extreme symptoms once she finds herself confined in the company of other patients in varying states of emotional alienation. It's also possible that she was experiencing withdrawal symptoms from the powerful drugs she had been taking, which were discontinued once she entered Willard, end quote. So there are several possibilities here. What I don't think it was schizophrenia. Margaret was 48 years old at the time of her admission to Willard. Most women with schizophrenia are diagnosed by age 30 at the latest. And Margaret didn't seem to have any symptoms other than anxiety and possible opiate abuse prior to her admission. After a month at Willard, Margaret remained depressed and hallucinated. 6 months after her admission, a psychiatrist wrote, quote, "This patient is definitely paranoid in her thinking and expresses delusional ideas about her commitment and intention here. Patient appears preoccupied, refuses to do any work, and spends most of her time in idleness," end quote. This is a personal pet peeve of mine when it comes to charting, and I see this a lot at my hospital, really at any hospital where I've worked. Something to the effect of, like, patient is being delusional and responding to internal stimuli, which is essentially what this psychiatrist wrote about Margaret. There's nothing substantial there. What is the patient saying that you think is delusional? Is she saying that aliens from the planet of the apes are coming in to get her at midnight? Because that sounds delusional. But what if she were saying that she should not be at the hospital because she doesn't have a mental illness? That's less delusional in her case. Also, when someone writes that a patient appears preoccupied, I always like it when they're a bit more descriptive about that. I'll give you an example. I once had a patient who always seemed to have a vacant look in his eyes, like he wasn't really focusing on anything, while mouthing entire conversations to himself. That's what I think of when I think of internal preoccupation. But Margaret was known to be quiet and reclusive. Perhaps her type of preoccupation looked different. All that to say that these vague chart notes really don't help sell the idea that this patient needed to be hospitalized indefinitely. Unfortunately, her chart would continue to have vague descriptions written in it for years to come. On September 2nd, 1942, her chart read, quote, "Paranoid, seclusive, no insight, physically well. This patient continues paranoid and is evidently hallucinated, although she denies hearing voices. She is asocial, she lacks insight, judgment is poor, and she feels she should be released from the hospital. Her physical condition appears satisfactory," end quote. On April 28th, 1947, and the authors actually had a note that there hadn't been a previous chart note on Margaret for 14 months before this one. Quote, "This patient is cooperative, pleasant, and docile, but has elaborate delusions and states that the examiner will be tried and sentenced for daring to examine her," end quote. This last line bothers me, and trigger warning here for themes of sexual assault. Skip ahead about 30 seconds if you're not in a space to listen because it is disturbing. One of the things we know about Willard and other facilities around this time is that women had mandatory gynecological exams. No matter what concerns they came in with, tuberculosis, heart problems, respiratory distress, they received a gynecological exam. There were no exemptions, so if a patient didn't want to participate, the physician would force the exam. It's not clear from the physician's note what type of exam he was conducting, but it's possible that Margaret may have feared getting a gynecological exam, even if that's not what the doctor was planning. She had been at the hospital for almost 6 years at this point. Who knows what kind of exams she had undergone by that point? August 21st, 1952, quote, "Silly, hallucinated. This patient is at times incoherent and markedly irrelevant. She was very hostile during the interview, but lacked appropriate emotion. She was quite silly, pretending to clear her throat again and again. She is markedly hallucinated," end quote. Now, I have a tendency to call people a silly goose, if in fact they are being a silly goose. But I cannot imagine writing a chart note saying that one of my patients is silly because they're clearing their throat repeatedly. Even if they're doing it to be funny or to make me laugh, I'd find another way to explain it without using the word silly. In the 1960s, so 20 years after Margaret's admission to Willard, she was prescribed heavy doses of Thorazine, a high potency antipsychotic. Thorazine is notorious for being overly sedative and for other side effects like tardive dyskinesia and what is commonly referred to as the Thorazine shuffle. A chart note dated May 1st, 1969 reads, quote, "This patient has shown no change in her mental condition. She is still somewhat withdrawn and delusional. She is inappropriate in her affect. Judgment continues to be impaired," end quote. In 1973, Margaret died at Willard State Hospital at the age of 81. She had been a patient there for 32 years. And for what? Anxiety, trauma, chronic medical problems, and pain that doctors later told her were psychosomatic or all in her head. This woman had committed no crime. She was not dangerous to herself or to others. She was not impaired in her ability to take care of herself. This was someone who held a full-time job while trying to manage several major stressors all at once. Unless there's something else that I'm missing, none of that seems like a reason to hospitalize her for decades until her death. And then 22 years after Margaret died, her 18 trunks, suitcases, boxes, and bundles were recovered from the attic at Willard. Several years later, once they were finally opened, this is what Penny and Stastny discovered. Quote, "A box, cardboard, black with silver squares of graded sizes on the bottom and white with silver squares of graded sizes on the top, contains patterns and sewing notions, various colors of DMC cotton pearl, embroidery floss, and unused and used skeins, packages of needles, eight buttons, small number of safety pins, straight pins, tacks, and paper clips, one necklace closure, short ivory crochet hook, one button hook, lace edging, spools of cotton and silk thread, snaps and hooks and eyes, scraps of fabric, 2 small bars of ivory soap, 8 paper patterns for dresses from the late 1920s and early 1930s. Margaret Dunleavy's trunk had by far the largest accumulation of personal possessions among the suitcase owners. Dishes, pots and pans, kitchenware, small appliances, lamps, clothing, sewing notions, fabric and patterns, needlework pieces in progress, books, a few odds and ends of furniture, nurses' uniforms, framed prints and family photos, legal documents, dozens of cards and letters, and hundreds of negatives and photographs. Her belongings suggest that she was an industrious, neat, and meticulous woman whose possessions were well cared for and carefully chosen for their quality and aesthetic value. The 1930s era housewares, which today are sought after collector's items, are in mint condition. Her boxes contained a Pyrex glass pitcher, an aluminum coffee percolator with pale green depression glass insert, a set of matching ridged canisters of the same green glass, enamelware pots, bowls, basins, an Art Deco syrup pitcher, and a flatware set with colorful plastic handles. She had a taste for fine pottery, a small Japanese porcelain vase, a larger, brightly painted Italian vase, beautifully decorated blue lustreware bowls, and one delicate hand-painted bone china teacup and saucer. She also owned a small desk fan, an electric hot plate, a Baby Ben alarm clock, an iron, and a pair of ice skates, all in remarkably good condition after being packed away for more than 60 years. There were portfolios of Margaret's papers, including her nursing diplomas from London and New York, student transcripts and evaluations, a handwritten resume, her U.S. citizenship papers, and her will. She saved many greeting cards, postcards, and letters from friends, family, and coworkers, and collected maps, as well as tourist brochures and picture postcards from her travels. Among her belongings were hundreds of photographs of family and friends and of her many trips, end quote. Margaret Dunleavy was clearly a bright, hardworking, determined woman who had endured many tragedies throughout her life. Her suitcases showcase her career path, her relationships with friends and family, her crafts and hobbies, her life. And to think that all of that was moved up to an attic and forgotten about so that she could never read those letters or see those pictures again. It shows how these old hospitals stripped people of their humanity in the name of treatment. Today's psychiatric care isn't perfect, but we're striving to do better for patients like Margaret, to do better at understanding what they've been through and what may help explain their symptoms. We have more checks and balances in getting patients to state hospitals so that one doctor's opinion doesn't sentence someone to 32 years away from their family. Margaret deserved better. So many patients deserved better. And that's where I'll end the story of Margaret Dunleavy. I'm going to tell one more patient story next week, and then I'm going to present a spooky, ooky story from Willard in 2 weeks. Because what's a creepy old insane asylum without a few ghost stories, right? So stay tuned for that. Once again, thank you so much for listening. I cannot believe we have 10,000 downloads. So I hope you keep listening. I hope you keep sharing. And I hope you take a moment to rate and review wherever you're listening. I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much. And as always, remember, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World's Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.